Happy holidays once again, and thank you again for taking some of the time away from your holiday festivities to spend with me as we continue to talk about the Karen Reed case. So there's something that I just naturally do when I'm watching these trials. I can't help it, just being a trial lawyer. This is what I automatically do, is I put myself in the position of the prosecutor and the defense attorney that I am watching and think about whether I'd be doing anything differently than they're doing. Not that it would be any better, but just the way that I think. So there was an idea that I had about how some of the closing arguments would go if I was representing Karen Reed. And I think it's an interesting idea. Not that Callan Jackson didn't do a good job. Obviously, he knows what he's doing. He doesn't need any of my help. But this is just an idea that I had. And it was an idea that I really got, that I'm going to borrow from a prosecutor who used this idea in the Michelle Troconis trial. So if you are familiar with what happened in the Michelle Troconis trial, then I don't have to explain much. But just to give you a quick recap of what happened in Michelle Troconis trial, is that Michelle Troconis had this boyfriend, Fotis Dulis. Fotis Dulis was previously married to Jennifer Dulis, and Jennifer Dulis was murdered by Fotis Dulis. That was pretty clear. Then Fotis Dulis took his own life, and now they were charging Michelle Troconis as part of the conspiracy to commit this murder. Okay, so she was. The allegations here is that she was part of this conspiracy. So right away, when you're thinking conspiracy, you may start to make some parallels to the Karen Reed case, especially to the people that are very bent on the position that there was a conspiracy here. Now, as you know my position already, I am not thoroughly convinced that there was a conspiracy. I don't know who was involved with the conspiracy, if there was a conspiracy. So it's not something that I spent too much time on trying to prove to you that there was a conspiracy. That's not what I felt was so important in this case. What to me was important in this case was whether the Commonwealth met their burden and proved this case beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's really where my analysis essentially ended. Now, there are some questions about maybe there was some sort of cover-up, some sort of conspiracy, who exactly was involved, and all those questions, which I think are decent questions and maybe could be researched, but I didn't really spend too much time in trying to prove that, because to me, it doesn't really matter so much whether you can prove that there's a conspiracy. Then what matters is whether the Commonwealth proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. So we've explained that, my position, already in previous videos. But nevertheless, still, I think it's worthwhile to point out to the jury that there's some pieces of evidence here that just doesn't add up. And something that I saw from the Michelle Troconis trial is that you have the prosecutor trying to show that Michelle Troconis was involved in this conspiracy, and it was largely circumstantial evidence, extremely circumstantial evidence, that what her involvement was at all. So I want to show you a clip from the closing argument, which I think was so effective, which maybe even led the jury to come to their guilty verdict against Michelle Troconis, because a lot of her actions you were able to answer for. And it's just when you put the totality of all of the actions together, that's when things start to not make sense so much, that all of these things have answers to them. And this is what the prosecutor did in his case. So I'm going to just pull up the closing argument. We're going to watch the closing argument together a little bit, and then we're going to borrow that idea to use that in the Karen Reed case. I'm going to put together a little presentation for you for that. I'm spending my holiday time wisely. I put a little PowerPoint together because that's how I argue my closing arguments. I always put together a PowerPoint, and I walk the jury through my PowerPoint. And what I do is, just so you should know, is that when a trial starts, I really have an outline of what my closing argument is going to look like. Basically, it's a rough outline. I know which points I'm going to have to argue one way or the other. So I have that basic outline, and I do have some sort of PowerPoint already put together. But then as the trial continues to progress and I see how the witnesses testify, and I think there are certain things that I really want to stress in the closing argument, so then of course I'm going to add to the closing argument, to add to the closing arguments, add to the PowerPoint, add some more slides or things like that. And then literally it's the night before the closing arguments. That's usually when I put the finishing touches on it. And sometimes even during trial, if we're about to go to closing arguments and the judge will give us a little bit of a break, I'll still be touching it up at that point as well. So I'm going to be giving you a small snippet, a little picture about what I would be doing with my slides, just as it relates to this specific issue about proving whether there's a conspiracy or not. So let's just watch this closing argument for a little bit, and then you'll see how we're going to do this as well in the Karen Reed case.
I want to just talk to you now, because the evidence in this case has proven the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I want to just pose these questions to you as you head into your deliberations? Is it really just a bunch of coincidences? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant answered Doulos' phone at 4 Jefferson Crossing when he was murdering his wife in New Canaan? Is it just a coincidence that Doulos' phone is being moved and manipulated when only the defendant is home? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant brought cleaning supplies to 80 Mountain Spring Road where you know the cleanup of the Tacoma was going on? Is it just a coincidence that the call from Greece is not in the defendant's timeline? Is it just a coincidence that during the cleanup, only hours after Jennifer was murdered, the defendant is shuttling back and forth between 4 Jefferson and 80 Mountain Spring Road? Is it just a coincidence during these trips back and forth, the defendant starts a fire at 4 Jefferson Crossing? Is it just a coincidence that during these trips back and forth, the defendant starts a second fire at 4 Jefferson Crossing? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant eventually lights a third fire at 4 Jefferson Crossing? Is it just a coincidence that while Doulos is cleaning the Tacoma, she takes a brown stained paper towel from him and throws it in the trash? Is it just a coincidence that despite no one telling her to, she took the keys to the Tacoma? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant travels with Doulos to Hartford as he disposes of the evidence on the same day? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant brought black garbage bags to 80 Mountain and Jennifer's shirt and bra were found inside black trash bags? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant brought a green and yellow sponge to 80 Mountain Spring Road and 2 of those were found in the trash in Hartford? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant brought a broom and the police found a mop or a broom handle in the trash at Albany Avenue in Hartford? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant opened the door to the Raptor at the exact moment that Doulos exits the vehicle to dump those license plates in the sewer and block that other vehicle's view? Is it just a coincidence that despite her daughter not being home, the defendant panicked when the police came to the house, went to 3 separate rooms and said, "I don't want to be here"? By the way, if the police come to someone's door while their child is not home, would you expect a reasonable person to immediately go to the door to make sure the child is okay? Unless, of course, that person just knowingly committed a crime. Is it just a coincidence that the defendant followed photos to the car wash and then tried to lie about it? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant's phone number and not Doulos' number was used at the car wash? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant lied and said she showered with Doulos when he was actually en route to murder his wife? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant lied about seeing Doulos in the office again while he was in New Canaan, murdering his wife? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant initially denied seeing Doulos' phone on the morning that Jennifer was murdered? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant said she saw Doulos meeting with Kent Mawhinney at 4 Jefferson Crossing around the time of Jennifer's murder, the same information that was in Doulos' timeline? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant never mentioned starting a fire to the police until they confronted her in the third and final interview? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant failed to mention that the Tacoma was at 80 Mountain Spring Road during her first 2 interviews? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant never mentioned that Doulos had washed the Tacoma during her first 2 interviews? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant answered the one call mentioned in Doulos' timeline on that morning as having been answered by him on the morning of his wife's murder? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant failed to tell police that Phyllis Doulos' bicycle was at 80 Mountain Spring Road until the third and final interview? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant lied about not going back to 80 Mountain Spring Road to return those keys? Is it just a coincidence that Doulos told Pavel Gameney to keep the defendant, quote, out of this when Gameney brought up the defendant taking his keys? Is it just a coincidence that the defendant's DNA was found on the opening of a garbage bag that also contained bloodstains, tape, and Jennifer Doulos' DNA? Are all these things just coincidences? Or is the defendant guilty? Now,
So I thought that was very powerful. When I was watching this trial, I thought that was extremely powerful, the way that he, all these coincidences where you can try to start explaining away each one of the coincidences, but come on, all the coincidences together, that means that there was a conspiracy. And that's how they were able to eventually get, their guilty verdict against Michelle Troconis, by showing, look, there's so many coincidences that you have to start explaining away that it makes a lot more sense that this was actually a conspiracy. So using that same type of approach, using that same logic when it comes to the Karen Reed case, we can also plug in some of these coincidences. And now I went through a number of them. I'm going to put them up. I'm sure there's more, and I know we have a very astute audience here, and they may catch some things that I didn't catch, but this was just kind of my quick review from some of the evidence, which are all coincidences, which would either be explained away, each one individually, or altogether seems like there's something more going on here. Now, I'm not going to say very clearly, I'm not going to say that this proves to me or that proves to you that there is an absolutely conspiracy here. I'm not saying that. And I've never said that. And I'm not wholly convinced that there was a conspiracy just yet. I haven't seen enough evidence of it. But these things definitely bring out some questions. It brings out doubt about whether the jury is getting the full story. So if I'd be presenting this as a closing argument, I wouldn't necessarily be arguing that you see clearly 100% that there's a conspiracy here. What I would be showing with all these coincidences that can either be explained or it shows that you, the jury, do not have the full story here. And if you don't have the full story, that's going to create reasonable doubt. Okay, so we're going to pull that up, but actually the first slide is a little bit of a different argument that I would also make to the jury. And I think it's a very strong argument. And I always love to put the other lawyer on the spot. If I'm able to do this, if I have a real gotcha moment, I love to, in my closing argument, say, I hope the other attorney can get up here and explain to you the following, because what we saw in trial brings out this issue, and I don't know why the other attorney is ignoring it. I hope he gets up here now, or she gets up here now, and can explain to you what it is and why they decided not to talk about it or something like that. Okay, so that's just what I'm going to touch on first, and then we're going to get into how I would present the coincidences. Okay, so let's just pull this up. So this is my slide right here. This is my little PowerPoint. So, ladies and gentlemen, the prosecutor has a job. Now, some of you may think that the prosecutor's job is to convict people. Well, actually, that's not what the Massachusetts courts say. And this is a direct quote from case law in Massachusetts. The prosecutor's role is to assist the jury in discovering the truth, not merely to secure a conviction. So if you are a prosecutor, your job is to assist the jury in discovering the truth, which would mean presenting all of the evidence to the jury, not trying to hide evidence, not trying to not hire people that are necessary for the jury to understand from their expertise how to interpret certain facts and certain evidence. Your job as a prosecutor is to provide the truth, to provide the tools in which the jury can see the truth, not to secure convictions. That's very important. And therefore, I have a question for the prosecutor in this case, the Karen Reed case. Okay, and hopefully, this is what I would say. Hopefully, Mr. Lally can get up here, or the other attorney, Mr. Lally can get up here and explain to you why he didn't do this for you. Because if he's trying to secure a conviction, I understand it. I understand why he wouldn't be doing something. But if he's honest to his role, and his role is to assist the jury in discovering the truth, well, then he should have done something. You know what that is, ladies and gentlemen? The prosecutor in this case, the Commonwealth in this case, should have called the two ARCA experts. Why do we have to call them? In their case, they should have called them. After all, maybe they don't like what they're saying, but if they're just here to help the jury in discovering the truth, don't you think that having these two biomechanical experts who are extremely qualified as accident reconstructionists, don't you think that that would help the jury in discovering the truth? And you heard from both Dr. Wolf and Dr. Rentschler that they made themselves available to both the defense and the prosecution. So I want to know, why didn't the prosecution call these witnesses as part of their case? You're right, it may not look good for you, but if a prosecutor is honest to his role and the Commonwealth is honest to their role is just discovering the truth. So they should put all the evidence in front of you, whether it helps them or not. Now, they can explain to you why they believe that those experts still do not prove anything and don't hurt the reason why you should lock up Karen Reed. That's fine. They can do that. They can argue. That's their opinion. But as their job is to show you everything. So why is it that we had to call these experts? Why is that? Did they really think that these experts are not reliable? They're not credible? And even if they believe that they're not credible, if this is all about discovering the truth, don't you think that they should have called these experts? So I think that's also a point that could have been made in the closing argument. Now let's move on. Okay, so let's go on to the coincidences. Is it just a coincidence that no one from law enforcement ever followed up with Brian Lucky Lawford until 2023 after the defense interviewed him? Is it just a coincidence that a piece of glass would stay on the bumper through being towed through a blizzard? How would that glass stay there? Is it just a coincidence that Jennifer McCabe deleted multiple calls that night, the night that John O'Keefe was murdered? Is it just a coincidence that the Alberts sold their house after the murder? Is it just a coincidence that the Alberts rehomed their dog of 6 years, 4 months, 6 to 7 years, 4 months after the murder? Is it just a coincidence that Brian Albert called Brian Higgins that night at 2:22 a.m., which was, I guess, a butt dial? Is it just a coincidence that Brian Higgins called Brian Albert back that phone call lasted 22 seconds? Is that just a coincidence that that's when that butt dial happened to happen? Is it just a coincidence that Brian Albert's first phone call the next morning was to Brian Higgins? Is it just a coincidence that Brian Higgins destroyed his phone and SIM card in a dumpster in a military base? Is it just a coincidence that Brian Albert also got rid of his phone after the murder of John O'Keefe? Is it just a coincidence that 34 Fairview was never searched when a dead body ended up on their lawn from someone who was invited to their house? Is it just a coincidence? Is there really not probable cause to be able to search that house? Is it just a coincidence that Brian Higgins went back to the police station after he left the Alberts that night? Is it just a coincidence that Brian Albert never came out of his house when 6 emergency vehicles with engines running and lights on were outside his bedroom? Think he slept through all that? Is it just a coincidence that Colin Albert was left out of the report of people who were at 34 Fairview that night? Is it just a coincidence that John O'Keefe's phone registered steps going up and down stairs minutes before his death? Is it just a coincidence that there is missing surveillance footage from the Sally Port when Karen Reed's Lexus was there? Is it just a coincidence that the Sally Port video was inverted during trial until we pointed out, meaning we, if you're acting like the defense attorney? Is it just a coincidence that it took 3 months to get evidence sent to the lab for testing? Is it just a coincidence that all the people that left 34 Fairview that night didn't see a 6'2" man lying in the front yard, which is, according to the Commonwealth, he was there. That's when John O'Keefe was there lying in the front yard. And all those people who left 34 Fairview didn't see it. Is that just a coincidence? Is it just a coincidence that Jennifer McCabe didn't tell the grand jury that Karen said, I hit him? Is it just a coincidence that no broken pieces of taillights were initially found on the scene? They're only discovered magically later. Is it just a coincidence that John O'Keefe's shoe was located on the curb when the experts say the strike the Commonwealth suggested happened would not have caused the shoe to come off? That's what the ARC expert said. Sideswipe would never cause a shoe to come off. Is it just a coincidence that, according to the key cycles, the Lexus was in police custody when it recorded doing 24 miles per hour backwards? So that is a number of coincidences, and that's something that you'd have to believe. So that, I think, would be a nice, effective way to tell the jury, look, I don't know if there's a conspiracy or not. We don't have to prove that there's a conspiracy, but I will tell you something. All these coincidences mean that we don't know really what happened that night. There's a lot of questions that are unanswered, unless you want to just chalk it all up to coincidence. And all these coincidences happen to happen the same time, over the same time span. So I think that was just an interesting idea. Maybe that can be incorporated into the closing arguments. But again, this new trial, who knows what's going to happen in this new trial? This is the new prosecutor, Hank Brennan. He may conduct the entire trial differently. He may bring up different arguments. Who knows? So we have yet to see what's going to happen. But I just thought that this was an interesting idea, an interesting exercise. And I'm sure some people will put in the comments things that I left out. And I'm sure people put in the comments why all these coincidences are really not coincidences. And really, it doesn't show anything. And really, Karen Reed is a guilty of sin. And that's fine. It's okay. It's healthy to have some debate. And like I said before, and I keep reiterating, I am not completely sold that there was a conspiracy. But I think that one of the problems where people keep falling for is that they have to choose one or the other. And therefore, they have trouble choosing the conspiracy over Karen Reed actually hit him. And to me, you don't have to choose. I'm not completely sold on conspiracy, but I definitely feel that there was a reasonable doubt that Karen Reed backed her car into. What actually happened, I don't know. I'd love to know, but I don't know. And during a trial, the jury really doesn't have to know either. And that's something that I always say has to be stressed to the jury if you're the defense attorney. You got to tell the jury, you don't have to pick one or the other. What you have to decide is whether the Commonwealth met their burden. Did they prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt? And we've already explained all the evidence as it relates to that and why I don't believe that the Commonwealth met their burden. Now, what actually happened that night, like I've been saying, I don't know. I don't know if there was a conspiracy. I don't know if there was a conspiracy, who was involved, if there was a cover-up. I don't know. All I know is that I see all those coincidences and I have got these ARCA experts. So I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what happened. So maybe that will become clear in the next trial. And if we have a clear answer to that, so then maybe we'll actually know what really happened that night. So that's going to be it for now. Thank you all for joining us. Happy holidays. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, like, and we will see you next time.